Interesting. Interesting. Okay. Morning. All right. Well, it is 10 o'clock. So I think that probably means time to get started, I guess. Back up a second. So we got to talking last week about elders and deacons and can you pay an elder and ministers and just kind of what that line is and where, what do you do? How do you handle those things? And there is some evidence to suggest that elders were compensated from an early time. It is also an established principle that ministers were and can be compensated. Paul is probably the person whom we see give the most information on that in First Corinthians. And effectively, Paul did several things at various times in his ministry. There was sometimes he hesitated to take money from the local congregation, but he was not hesitant to take money. So very frequently he would be supported by other congregations or individuals in a similar way to how we would support a missionary today. But there are some times where he just went out and worked and plied his trade as a tent maker, and he made enough to not only cover his expenses, but the expenses of all of those who were engaging in ministry with him. So we see several established principles. He also talks about the fact that it is perfectly okay for a congregation to pay a minister in some capacity. Now, what, how much, all that kind of stuff is very, very subjective. And so, I don't know that there's any right or wrong. There's a lot of opinions on that. Um, some congregations have full-time ministers, quote unquote, which is a more recent innovation within the church. Up until the 1950s, we had mainly ministers who had a day job and preached. So that's, again, more of a recent innovation on our part. Uh, but, there's nothing to say. The principle of having someone who engages full time in preaching and teaching is a good thing. But the challenge is, you want to throw an elder in the mix, and it's like that complicates things. And like I said, I've seen it done. I've seen it done well. I don't know of any instances where I've seen an elder serve as a preacher where it was done poorly necessarily. But it's one of those situations I encourage the person to really think about what they're doing. Because that's a hard job. Elder is a hard job. Minister is a hard job. And you mix the two together and you got a really hard job. So, Greg? Hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yes and no. So that adds a whole nother can of worms about a church being over a nonprofit and a para church organization. um, in another state. Yeah, so there is that is an interesting can of worms. But what I'll say is that Apologetics Press runs pretty independently. So, like, they may, have oversight and stewardship, but the day to day running of all of that stuff is pretty well automated. So, yeah. Yes, ma'am. Is there a difference? They are the same. It's interesting. So the term elder, episkopos, and the term or presbyteros, and the term um, manager, overseer, and the term shepherd are all used interchangeably within the New Testament. Now, words take on meaning, right? And so elder was the default term for hundreds of years, right? That's ever the elder, so and so, elder, thus and thus, yada, yada, yada. And probably around the 80s, there became a bit of a stigma around the term elder because a lot of elderships transitioned into more of a board of directors, right? They tended to be businessmen who conducted eldership responsibilities like it was a board meeting. And that's not to say that these men were uncaring, unloving, and unqualified. It means that they were reflecting the culture they had learned, right? And so if you live in a boardroom or you live, in a managerial position, that's where your strong suit is, right? But the problem with, you know, you can be too much of a manager and become overbearing, right? You know, and you can, neglect the shepherding side of things. And so there was a movement in the 80s to, I don't want to say soften elderships, in the sense of, maybe we've leaned too hard into the manager side of being an elder. Maybe we should lean more into the being a shepherd side of being an elder. And really, that book that we mentioned a couple weeks ago, They Smell Like Sheep by Lynn Anderson, had a big impact on that. And so, because in the book, the main premise of the book is looking at being a leader, an elder, from the viewpoint of being a shepherd, and what does it mean to be a shepherd? And the key phrase in the book is shepherds smell like sheep, right? Meaning that you cannot be a good leader in the congregation if you're not in the congregation, right? Because sometimes what had happened was that elderships became somewhat disconnected from the congregation because they're just looking at, information on a piece of paper, and they're sitting in the back room once a week making decisions. Well, that's not how you necessarily make decisions. And so there was a shift. And so a lot of congregations went from saying this is our eldership to saying these are our shepherds. But either or is fine. So it doesn't matter. So yeah, good question. Very good question. Other questions? Pastor is not that easy. What do you mean? Right. And so that's one of those ones where um there became the rise in what is called a monopastoralship, which is the rise of one pastor, mono one pastor. And what you had one guy who frequently functioned as an elder and the preacher, and he was the pastor. If you go back over to Ephesians chapter 4. All right. Verse 11, Ephesians 4 and 11. He gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry. In verse 4, or in verse 11, that shepherds is also pastors, may be what is translated in some of your versions there. And in some versions, it is also pastor teacher or shepherd teacher, right? Indicating that this individual was doing the bulk of the instruction in the local body. So we do see a relationship between elders being the primary teachers in the local congregation. There is a relationship there, because you got to think the number of congregations that were in the New Testament. Even if we say that there's, I don't know, let's just throw a number out there, 250 congregations, right, in the New Testament. I don't know exactly how many there were, but that seems like a reasonable number. Even if we said 100, right? How many apostles are there? 13-ish, right? And so, all right. And then how many full of the Holy Spirit people do we have? Well, we have record of, maybe another 15 or 20-ish, like Barnabas, right? Who's not an apostle, but he is a preacher, right? And so there's a good probability that there may not have been 200 some odd preachers the way that we think of it, or evangelists, as we'll talk about in a moment. So at some point, and they went around, right? They didn't necessarily stay in one place for 20 years. They may be there 2 years was long, or 3 years was a long time. So then, well, what do you do when one leaves, and you may not have a preacher come through for another 6 months or a year? Somebody's got to be responsible. And so the elders very frequently took on the role of instruction, of teaching and preaching. And but we had the rise within the denominational world of the idea of a pastor, which a pastor is just a holdover from a priest, right? Because the priest is over the local parish, or they may be over multiple parishes these days, but they held over the idea of priest into pastor, right? Now, some denominational churches may have elders, but the elders tend to function as deacons, right? So they take care of the physical needs of the congregation, whereas the pastor takes care of the spiritual needs of the congregation. And so the problem we run into is that in the cultural nomenclature, so how people use that word, is when people say pastor. So if somebody says pastor to me on the street or something, like, oh, you're a pastor, what they mean is, oh, you're a preacher. That's what they mean. They are not meaning the long, 1,500 years of history, or the 500 years of history. Like, that's not, that they didn't have that in mind, nor do they want a history lesson in that moment. I'd be happy to give it to them. I remember the first funeral I did. Maybe it was the second or third, but the hearse is there by the graveside. They've opened the door, and the pallbearers are getting the casket out, and I'm standing there looking, and the funeral director, Jeff, he says, "Okay, just follow past her and go up there." And I'm like, "Follow past her? Who? Past her? I don't see any women here." "Oh, pastor! Follow pastor. I better lead the procession." And so we did. And so I was so not used to people referring to me as that, right? And because so what I ended up doing, what I developed over time, because people would address me as title, right? Pastor. "Hey, pastor. Hey, pastor." And it was, who was it? Kim Ball. It was Kim Ball. I had to set her down. I love her dearly. I saw her last week. I set her down and I said, "Kim, Are we friends? Yeah. Call me Matt. And then that's how I handle those situations. When somebody calls me pastor, I said, hey, just call me Matt. I'm good with that, you know? And then I don't have to give a 500-year history lesson. But yeah, so yeah, the rise of pastoral ships is an interesting study, but at the end of the day, it's not how God designed His church to function. Um, and so it's one of those situations where people have been taught a thing, and it somewhat functions. However, that doesn't make it the way things ought to be. You know, so just because something can work and does work doesn't mean that's what we should do. And that's going to become an important discussion here in a minute when we talk about worship. But any other thoughts on that before we take care of one last thing on deacons? Yes, sir. Are we saying pastor in the sense of preacher or pastor in the sense of elder? So, yeah, okay. So, in the org chart of a local body of believers, right? So, in the organizational hierarchy, God designed it to be overseen by elders, right? Acts 20:28, 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, right? So the men who are making the decisions for the spiritual well-being of the body is supposed to be the elders, right? The elders, or the shepherds as they're called, or you could technically use the term pastor, but there's a lot of baggage with that term, right? The deacons oversee the physical needs of the local congregation. So elders are over the big picture of the congregation and the spiritual needs. The deacons take care of the light bulbs. And then you have a third position, which is that of minister or evangelist or teacher or preacher, right? And so by de facto, right, if I'm preaching, guess what? I'm talking about spiritual matters. So the preacher de facto has a spiritual influence on the congregation, right? Now, elders are supposed to be apt to teach. That's one of the requirements. And in the interim times, you know, where there's not a preacher around, or even if there is a preacher around, we'll talk about that in a minute, the elders teach. So it is very common for an elder to engage in teaching and preaching and those kinds of things. But so in a way, all elders are preachers and teachers, but not all preachers are elders or pastors. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so can you have multiple? Absolutely. Because God designed His church to have a plurality of elders. Every time we see reference to them, there is a plurality of them, and that prevents one guy from being the decision maker, because that's a problem. But also, when Paul would go around with his group, you might have 4 or 5 guys who are engaging as preachers or ministers within one congregation, right? There's definitely precedent for having multiple. The problem we run into today is that we just don't have enough men who want to do it, or have sufficient spiritual maturity to do it, because that's also a thing. It does me no good if it's for training purposes. That's fine, but it does me and Belafont no good if somebody gets up to preach and we just have to spend an hour correcting everything they taught wrong. You know what I mean? And so now that's never happened here, okay? But I have been in places where let's let so and so get up and speak. Okay, and that was a mistake. So the heart was in the right place, scripture was not. Good question. Very good question. Yeah, so plurality, not a problem. In a lot of ways, it's better because that lightens the load on the individual. Yep. So, and also, different strokes for different folks, right? So not everybody, likes certain presentation styles or certain ways that people speak, and it's nice to have variety. So, yep. All right. Any other questions there? Yes, ma'am. Uh huh. Yeah, and that's what I was gonna get to. Yeah, so let's put a pin in that because we're gonna get to that in a minute. But yes, all right. Anybody else? All right. This kind of ties into that, and we'll tie into our next little section of Romans chapter 16. Um, because as we talk about elders and deacons, we would be remiss if we did not mention Phoebe. Because in the instance it was mentioned there of lady pastors, you know that came out of the idea of lady preachers, because they're using pastor as preacher interchangeably, and some of that is going to be tied, as we'll see, to a misunderstanding of what women are actually allowed to do, because historically we've actually been a little more restrictive in some ways than we should have been, and as a result, it's like when you over discipline a child and they turn 18 and then just woo, right? So we overcorrected on some things, and as a result things swung so far the other way. So, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. But Romans 16 and Phoebe. I commend to you our sister Phoebe. Now, depending on your translation, this is where it's going to go. A servant of the church at Cenchrea, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need from you, for she has been a patron of many, and myself as well. Now, some versions are going to render chapter 16, verse 1 as our sister Phoebe, a deaconess of the church at Cenchrea. All right? And so that brings up the question. We're talking deacons. Was Phoebe a deaconess? And so was there an appointed position for female deacons? Okay? And this fundamentally comes down to our understanding of that word. So the word deacon is the Greek word diakonos, which is just their word for servant. Okay? Now, in other languages, words have gender. Our words have gender, but they don't often change in the way that other words change, right? So if we would say that Matt is a servant and Sarah is a servant, there is no change in how that word is spelled. Does that make sense? Same masculine or feminine, right? And if I go neuter, which is they are servants, the word does not change. In other languages, the word changes based on the gender of the person it's referring to, right? So if I am referring to a male servant in Greek, it would be diakonos. Frequently, if it is a collective group, right, it would still be diakonos because a lot of languages default to masculine. But if it was a female person referring to as a servant, it would use the feminine endings, right? And so Latino, Latina, right? So collectively, Latinos. And so this is probably one of the closest, things I can tell you. So the word here is the female version of servant in the Greek, right? The problem we run into is we have a word that refers to also an office. So you can have a servant, but not be the servant. Does that make sense? I'm going to use the definite articles here. And so the question becomes, was Phoebe, is it referring to her as just a commentary on she's a servant of the church, or is it identifying her as a appointed position within the church? And to answer that question, you would have to go back and look at the other requirements of being a deacon, which husband of one wife is one of those requirements. Probably she was not the husband of one wife. But also look at the history of it. And when we look back at the history of it, we don't see women serving as deacons in that way. Okay? Not in the appointed position of deacon. So in all probability, this is not referring to her in the appointed role of deacon, right? So she would not have been listed on the bulletin in the first century as Deaconess Phoebe, right? That's where we're going with that. However, right, you need to understand what Paul says about her in these verses. Because just because she's not officially on the books as a deacon did not mean that she was not an influential individual in the church. All right? So number one is, all right, he's writing to Rome, to the Roman church, and he is saying, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints and help her in whatever way she may need from you. All right? So Paul, inspired apostle, is telling them, you roll out the red carpet for her. Okay? You take care of her needs. Now, some speculate that Phoebe may have been the bearer of the letter to the Romans, that she may be the person who is taking the book of Romans to the church at Rome. Well, that's kind of an important job, right? It's not something that you trust to somebody who may lose it along the way. And so if she is the bearer of this letter, then that says a lot about Paul's trust for her, right? So that's one thing to note, all right? The second thing to note is that she has been a patron of many and myself as well. Patron. What does your version have? Benefactor, which means bankroller, right? That is what a patron is. We talk about someone as a patron of the arts or a benefactor, right? So that means that Phoebe is financially supported Paul and other individuals. So what does that tell you about Phoebe? She got money, all right? Now, she may have had money through her husband, or it could be a Lydia situation where she is a businesswoman and has her own money that she is using for God's glory, right? And there's some belief that she is also the host of the church in Cenchrea, right? Because that's what, Lydia did. So while Phoebe may not have been an appointed deacon, she is engaging in ministry in a variety of capacities available to her, right? So just because she doesn't have a title didn't mean she wasn't influential. And that's where we sometimes get a little wonky, right? Well, as long as I have the title. I have worked several places where the managers were not in charge. Oh, they had the title, but they didn't have a clue what to do. And so very frequently it fell to the workers to be actually in charge. And so that's just one of the things about humans, is the title is not indicative of the ability. Now, hopefully within the church, though, God has laid it out where we put men into positions that are qualified, and part of being qualified is able to do the job. So hopefully we don't run into that problem too often with elders and deacons, but it does happen. So, all right, any questions on Phoebe? Okay. All right. So we've talked elders, we've talked deacons. Now we need to talk about the third kind of positions within the church, third set of positions. And so the first two, elders and deacons, are decision makers. Okay? So elders make decisions about the spiritual well-being of the congregation. Deacons make decisions about the physical needs of the congregation. The fourth or the third category, we don't make decisions per se. We just do, right? So we're the workers, worker bees. And there are four terms, and this is outside of anybody, all of these are Christians, but this is four specific terms within the New Testament, and that is minister, preacher, evangelist, teacher. Okay? And so these are people who engage in an activity above just being a Christian. Okay? So let's turn over to Colossians chapter 1. All right? And this is probably as far as we will get today, but that is all right. So, because we're having discussion, and hopefully we are talking about things, and maybe talking about things that you have not talked about before, or talking about them in a way you have not talked about them before, that is beneficial to you. Okay, Colossians chapter 1. All right. Just as you learn, 1 verse 7, okay? Just as you learned from Epaphras, our beloved fellow servant, coincidentally, deacon, but not necessarily appointed deacon, servant. All right. He is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf and has made known to us your love in the Spirit. All right. Then let's go down to verse 23. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. All right? So a minister, and there's so much overlap in these terms. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish minister, preacher, evangelist, teacher, but they are a little different depending, but sometimes they're the same. But a minister is someone who takes care of needs, right? And so we don't use the term in America, but in England, they have the prime minister, right? They have the minister of agriculture, and those kind of things. And the term is they are the person that takes care of that thing, all right? So the term minister is kind of a catch-all term for someone who takes care of a need. More often than not in my career, I identify myself as a minister, right? Because it doesn't limit me to just preacher or teacher, right? Because I may do more. Like, technically, crawling under the baptistry to fix a leak is not a preacher. That is me as a minister, right? Telling the alarm company at 3 a.m., no one is breaking in, please go away. That is not me as a preacher. That is me as a minister. Yes, those are all things I did. And still did. They forgot to take me off the list after I left that congregation, and I got a call at 3 a.m. I'm like, go to the next person on the list, bud. Not me anymore. But here's the thing, right? Is there a limitation on who can take care of the needs of the congregation? No. Right? Because there are a lot of needs that need to get taken care of. We just talked about Phoebe. Phoebe took care of needs in the congregations. Lydia took care of needs in the congregation. And so this is a bit of a catch-all term. So all Christians are theoretically ministers, right? And so they serve in different capacities. And now Paul is talking about, so he's saying that Epaphras is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf. So he is describing him as someone who is engaging and taking care of people's needs because of Christ, right? As he describes himself in verse 23, he says that, I became a minister. He is the minister to the Gentiles. That is the demographic he tends to go and take care of. Now, did Paul go and minister to the Jews? Yeah. And so ministering to someone can have a lot of different possibilities. If I preach to someone, that is a ministry, right? Because the action is called your ministry, right? So if I preach to someone, I'm teaching to you right now, that is ministry. The food bank is ministry, right? We had our picnic, that is ministry. We do our walk for water, that is ministry. You are kind and loving to the person at the BMV. Guess what? That is ministry, right? So taking care of the needs of others is ministry. And so it is what you do as a Christian. And so that's kind of a catch-all term. So women are ministers, men are ministers. Anyone who is a Christian is a minister. And so the game becomes, or the question becomes, what is your ministry? So there is a responsibility that we as Christians all have to grow in our spiritual knowledge and spiritual maturity, right? So there is a point at which your ministry is just taking care of yourself first, right? Just like on the airplane, right? In the event of cabin depressurization, there will be oxygen masks that deploy from the ceiling. Please place the mask over yourself and tighten it before placing the mask on those around you, right? Your first responsibility is your spiritual condition, right? Take care of yourself first. Now, once you're doing that, that never stops, but then and it's one of those things where you talk about like the fruits of the Spirit, right? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, right? As you grow up spiritually, the natural outflowing of that should be the need to serve, to help others in some way, right? And that becomes what you have to figure out, is what is your ministry, right? I know a lady in a congregation that her ministry is communion preparation, all right? She prepares the communion every Sunday, all right? Not only does she prepare the communion every Sunday, she bakes the communion bread. They don't just buy matzah crackers. She goes home and every 6 months or so, she bakes a batch of communion bread. And that's what she does. It's really good. And so that is her ministry as she sees it. And when there are little girls who, are interested in it, what she's doing, she brings them in and mentors them to show them the ministry that she does. And so, there are lots of ministry opportunities. Most of them are not confined to the building, right? Most of the ministry opportunities that are out there in the world have nothing to do with this building, right? But there are ministry opportunities, right, within the building, right? We have to organize meals when we have meals. We have to have lights that work, right? We have to have those things. And so it's figuring out what your ministry is going to be. Any thoughts or questions on that? It can change. If you're a parent, guess what? That's your number one ministry, right? Now, that doesn't mean you don't do other things, but that is your number one ministry. So one of the roles within the church is being a minister. Now, as all Christians are ministers, but as Paul and the others frequently refer to it, they are meaning minister in the sense of the person who engages in the preaching and teaching, right? That's what they mean. So it is a catch-all term, but 75-80% of the time it gets used. So like here in Colossians 1, he's meaning minister in the sense of the person engaging in teaching or preaching. Okay? So that brings us to the next term, which is a preacher. All right? Turn over with me to 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2. That would be because I was in Thessalonians. Yeah. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 7. For this I was appointed a preacher and an apostle, and I am telling the truth. I am not lying, a teacher of the Gentiles in faith and in truth. Now, this is what makes the kind of minister I am and the kind of minister that Belafont is and the kind of preacher we are different. We are appointed to this position, right? So the position that I am in, the men of the congregation said, Matt, we'd like for you to do this. Cool. Year goes by, Matt, we still would like for you to do this. So I am appointed. There can come a day where they say, Matt, you were unappointed. That won't be how it gets phrased, but that's how it can't, basically they can stop it, right? For the Christian, though, if you're a minister, guess what? You get to just be a minister. Now, can they come and say, look, we don't want you changing the light bulbs anymore? Yeah. Could they say, yeah, we don't want you changing out the light fixtures? Yeah. But generally, that's only going to happen because something caught fire. Like, right? That's, I have very rarely ever seen someone be asked to stop their personal ministry. The only times I've ever heard of that happening was when someone was either was being not Christian in their personal ministry, right? And so it was more of their hobby. And then B, when they were doing so to the exclusion of other Christians, right? So just because someone is the bus driver, not that this would ever happen, just because you have been driving that bus every Sunday for 20 years does not mean you should be the only person allowed to drive the bus. Does not mean you should yell at the youth group because they backed the bus into the garage 3 feet away from the wall instead of 6 feet away from the wall. Things that have happened in my time in ministry. So, but Paul is telling Timothy here, he is identifying that he was appointed as a preacher. He was appointed as apostle. He was appointed as a teacher. And so the idea of preacher, that word is a proclaimer, is the idea. Preaching is about proclaiming, speaking, okay? And he uses all of these different words, and that kind of tells us that these are not all the same thing in his mind, right? He's not being repetitive. He is talking about different functions that he engages in. Turn over a book to 2 Timothy chapter 1. And then we'll see again in verse 11 that he says, for which I was appointed a preacher, an apostle, and a teacher. So again, he distinguishes between those roles within his ministry. And so a preacher is a proclaimer or herald of divine truth, especially pertaining to the gospel. So, an argument could be made that most sermons, when we get up and speak, most sermons are not functioning as preaching. This is where it's going to get a little trippy. Most sermons are not actually preaching. They are actually teaching. Now, is proclaiming happening? Yes. Are we telling divine truth? Yes. But are we normally preaching happens to the lost, right? Normally that is the audience of preaching. And so when it says that Paul went and preached and like, normally he is talking to a group of non-Christians, right? Now, it's interesting that when you go and read in the book of Acts, where Paul, quote, preached until midnight, right? You remember that one? Acts chapter 20. Now, Paul talked with them, intending to depart the next day, and he, what's your version say? What did he do? He preached until midnight. Somebody have that in their version? Somebody have, he prolonged his speech until midnight? Something like that? Yeah. So, Paul, the word there is dialogomena, which is the word we get our word dialogue from. So he dialogued with them until midnight. Well, dialogue, I understand there are some people who think dialogues are meant to be one-way conversations, but in reality, a dialogue is meant to be a back-and-forth conversation. So this class is a dialogue. So preaching, more often than not, involved proclaiming the truth to those who do not know the truth, right? So there's a good chance that on a Sunday, we may not actually be preaching from the pulpit. We may simply be teaching. Does it really matter? No. So this is one of those terms where you call me a preacher, I don't have nameplates, and so depending on what the sermon is, I change out the nameplates. Today, Matt is Minister Matt. Today, Matt is Preacher Matt. Like today, Matt is Evangelist Matt. No. Because preacher, minister, evangelist, teacher are so overlapping in how they're used that it's not really a problem, right? Are there any questions on that? Okay, we've run out of time, so we're going to pause right there, and we'll pick up next time. Chiama?